Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasegawa, and this is episode 117. Today's guest is Maggie Smith. Hey there, folks. Welcome to the show. On today's episode, I'm pleased to welcome poet Maggie Smith back to the show. Maggie Smith is the author of 3 books of poetry: Good Bones, published by Tupelo Press in 2017, The Well Speaks of Its Own Poison, published in 2015, and Lamp of the Body, published by Red Hen Press in 2005. Smith is also the author of 3 prize-winning chapbooks. Her poems are widely published and anthologized, appearing in Best American Poetry, The New York Times, The New Yorker, Tin House, Poetry, The Paris Review, Plowshares, and elsewhere. In 2016, her poem Good Bones went viral internationally and has been translated into nearly a dozen languages. Public Radio International called it the official poem of 2016. Her new book, Keep Moving, Notes on Loss, Creativity, and Change, a collection of essays and quotes, was just published in October 2020 by One Signal Simon & Schuster. If you've been with the show for a while, you may remember Maggie's previous appearance on the show back in 2017 when we talked about her book Good Bones, and if you haven't listened to that one, I do recommend going back and checking it out. But this time Maggie and I are talking about her new book, Keep Moving, which represents something quite new for Maggie, and you'll hear all about that in just a bit. This book is one that was born out of a difficult and challenging life change, and what I love about it is very much what I loved about Good Bones. I'm reminded of something Maggie said about her poems when we talked before, how they acknowledge the darkness but turn their faces toward the light. In Keep Moving, Maggie writes about her divorce, about leaving behind one narrative and moving into an unknown future. It's specific and personal, but it speaks to a feeling that I think will be familiar to just about everyone, especially right now. And I'm so happy to be able to share this conversation with you. I've put a bookshop.org link in the show notes where you can purchase a copy of Keep Moving. As always, I also highly recommend ordering it from your local independent bookstore. Also, starting this week and running through November 14th, Maggie will be doing a virtual book tour to celebrate the launch of Keep Moving. A few upcoming dates. On October 8th, 2020, Maggie will be in conversation with poet Molly Spencer via Literati Bookstore in Ann Arbor, Michigan. That runs from 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern. Then on October 14th, Maggie will be in conversation with Rebecca Soffer via Books Are Magic in Brooklyn, New York. That runs from 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern. And on October 15th, Maggie will be in conversation with Saeed Jones via Gramercy Books in Bexley, Ohio. That runs from 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern. I put links to all of those in the show notes. You'll need to register in advance to join the Zoom meetings. I've also put a link to the events page on Maggie's website where you can find all of her upcoming virtual events. Finally, one quick programming note about the show before we start. On October 21st, I'll be airing our next KTCO Book Club conversation. That's our next episode. Writer Elisa Herod and I will be discussing Tove Jansson's 1982 novel, The True Deceiver. I'd love for you to join in the conversation. So if you haven't read the book yet, there's a link in the show notes where you can order a copy. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on the book. So you can either email me at podcast@keepthechanneleopen.com, or even better, use the KTCO Book Club hashtag on Twitter and tweet me your screenshots, quotations, comments, all that good stuff. All right, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Maggie Smith. So, I'm so pleased to have you back on the show. I mentioned in the pre-show that I had just re-listened to our previous conversation in 2017, and that was such a good conversation. I'm really interested because this book is so much different from Good Bones, but I also feel like I see some similarities to it. And so I wanted to maybe start with her because this book, it's very much about change, and it's very much about, things being unexpected, sort of the way that the world can and your life can be different from one moment to another. And when I was listening back to our old conversation, that was actually something that we talked a fair amount about when we were talking about Good Bones as well, that there are poems in Good Bones that are talking about the way that, for example, your hometown isn't the same as the way that it used to be. Or there's one poem that you actually even read in that conversation that we had was At Your Age I Wore a Darkness, which is at least in part about, at least in the end, it's about preparing your daughter for, for when you're not going to be there anymore.
Right.
So it feels a little bit to me like there is a bit of a through line, even though it wasn't immediately obvious to me the first time I read through Keep Moving. But I wanted to sort of see how that struck you, and maybe we could start with that.
That's funny. I remember giving a reading from the book Good Bones. It must have been in either late 2017 or early 2018 when the book was fairly new. And a question from the audience was about being a single parent. And I remember laughing because I was married. And I was like, what are you talking about? I'm married. I'm not a single parent. First of all, not all of the poems are autobiographical, but also it just hadn't occurred to me that the book was so much about myself and my children, and that my now ex-husband doesn't appear in any of the poems. And, we had been together for 17 years at that point. So it felt kind of prescient in a way that I was kind of writing my single motherhood book years before I was actually a single mother. So yeah, the book, in some ways, that book of poems is about big existential shifts. And the big existential shift really in that book is about from not a parent to a parent, and what that means when suddenly you're not on your own, but you're really in charge of others and are sort of their tour guide in the world, and have to choose what to reveal and what to keep close. And, when you tell them things, when do you tell them, and how do you tell them, and sort of how do you introduce or shape the world that you brought them to? How do you introduce them to that? So that was really the big shift. And the thing I was grappling with, I think, the most in that book was, how do I do this? And really, it's funny you say that, because Keep Moving is sort of a how do I do this book too. It's just, how do I do this, i.e. life, by myself? So yeah, this book is different. It's prose, which is, a first for me. Honestly, though, I have to say I really enjoyed writing essays, and the book I'm working on now is a collection of essays. So I really enjoyed it, and I've always written poems. That's been my comfort genre, has been the poem. But there are some things you can't do in a poem. There are some stories you can't tell. There are some things you just need a little bit more room for. And so I felt like in this book, I was able to kind of stretch my legs. Even just beginning to write essays at the end of my marriage, I would try to write poems first. And then I would feel like I was like in an extreme tiny house or something, and I was bumping my head and my elbows, and I couldn't stand up and I couldn't move and I couldn't say all the things that I wanted to say. And I realized, I think I'm going to need a different container for this story, for what I want to say. And it's not going to be a novel. So I think it's probably going to be an essay, and let's just see what happens there. So yeah, so this book was really, well, first of all, it didn't really start out as a book. Right. Or even the idea that it would be a book. It started out as a series of tweets, which I realize sounds ridiculous. And even the word tweet is ridiculous. So to say that you built a book out of tweets, like, it sounds frivolous to me. But, at the end of my marriage, when things were really terrible, just like awful, I started tweeting each day, just a little pep talk to myself that I could kind of come back to, and it would keep me sort of grounded and almost like set the stage for the day, because I would usually write them in the morning before my coffee, sometimes on my phone before I even turned the light on and got out of bed. And it would be the way that I would kind of set the stage for myself for the day, so that I didn't get sidetracked by grief or anger or confusion or panic. And then I would share them, not because I thought that they would help a lot of other people. I just shared them as a way of holding myself accountable for sort of paying attention to whatever that thing was that I thought I needed to pay attention to that day, but also as a way of sort of coming out as struggling in public, which I don't know is scary, but also, so much of social media, I think, is so curated, right? Like the pictures we post are pictures where we look good. And the pictures we post of our homes are like the one day that everything doesn't look terrible and there aren't, kids' toys everywhere and dishes in the sink. And, we tend to post when we have professional successes. We don't always post when we get a rejection or the interview doesn't turn out the way we wanted or we don't get the job. So it just felt to me to be important in that moment to also just admit to having a really hard time so that maybe other people who were having a really hard time would say, oh, okay, so it's not just me. Other people are really in the weeds too, but they're functioning and they're still sort of pressing on. And maybe if we can sort of create a sense of community with all of us who are having a hard time, it doesn't feel so lonely.
Yeah. So you've been doing these tweets since October of 2 years ago. And
yeah.
So I've been seeing these tweets, pretty regularly since then. And just as you said now, you address this in the book too, that you view them as goals for yourself, right? But it's been interesting to see sort of the response that your followers give these tweets, I think, because I think a lot of people seem to take them like more as advice than as goals. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's interesting because, all of them are just notes to self. So the you in every single quote is me.
Yeah.
I'm just talking to myself. I'm just talking to myself in public and people are eavesdropping, basically. But what really surprised me, honestly, it surprised me how much the post took off in the first place, but it really surprised me how much they resonated with people in a way I hadn't anticipated, because I wrote them for me, but then I kept hearing from people in either DMs or comments or, people I knew would email or text me. And sometimes they would joke like, were you hiding in the closet in my therapist's office? Or are you on my group chat? But people would say again and again, like, I feel like you wrote this just for me. And that's when I think, hearing that day in and day out, I realized like, oh, okay, so the stuff I'm going through is unique to me, but it's not actually that unique, because really what it was, for me, it was divorce, but we all go through periods in our lives where like the rug is pulled out from underneath us, or what we thought we knew about a person or situation, whether it's personal or professional, is not the way that it is. Or maybe it was that way, but it's not that way anymore. And so I think we all have these sort of what now crises in our lives. And it might be a diagnosis or something that's going on with a family member or a breakup or a job loss or a move or, whatever the thing is. And for whatever reason, what I was saying to myself each day would resonate with other people. And that's really where the idea for the book came from, because people started asking for a book, which is not how poetry books are made. I mean, I've never written poems and then someone asked, why isn't this in a book? It's just you write a lot of poems and then you get enough that you have a book and then you arrange it and you send it to a publisher. But this book came about in a really sort of strange but deliciously organic way. And that people said, I wish I could give this to my neighbor who's having a really tough time, or my best friend's going through a divorce, and I would love to have these collected in a form that I could give to her as a gift, or I would love to have these on my bedside table. Or I would just see people, screenshotting them or writing them down in their own handwriting or printing them off. And I thought, oh, maybe these should or could live someplace other than in the ether.
Yeah.
And that's when we started thinking about, okay, so could it be a book, and then will it just be quotes, or could it be something else? And it ended up being something else. So it's 6 essays with the quotes kind of folded in among them.
Yeah. At least when I've noticed it, the most common thing that I see people saying is, this is exactly what I needed to hear today. And then very often you'll say something back like, yeah, this is what I needed to hear today too.
Yeah, exactly. Because I was talking to myself, like, this is the space I'm in. And it's also been like, honestly, really helpful for me personally to have people, many of whom I don't know, say, I am in this space too. Because then we're sharing something, and then I don't feel so alone in it. So sort of ironically, in a time when I felt most alone in my life, I kind of threw it out there like, hey guys, I'm really struggling and feeling alone, and this is what's happening. And what happened was I heard all of these people talking back to me saying, oh yeah, me too, me too, me too. And then I wasn't by myself anymore. And I mean, I feel that acutely now, especially with the level of isolation that we're all feeling because of the pandemic. I mean, it's funny, not haha funny, but funny that I wrote this book in the wake of my divorce when my life was an absolute mess, but the world felt a little more sensible than it feels right now. Not greatly, not a lot more sensible. We still had the current administration, but it felt at least slightly more sensible than it does now. And now I feel like my life feels generally a lot better, but the world feels a lot worse. And in some ways, all of that kind of what now feeling has been brought back up again, because although I feel a lot more settled in sort of where I am with my life and my children and my career, and sort of I'm finding my own way personally through this and through the last couple of years. Right now, just, globally as a society, we have no idea what's coming next. And we're all feeling a lot of insecurity and fear and anger and all of those same feelings that I had when I thought I was by myself and my marriage was falling apart. I think we're all in some way, shape, or form collectively feeling now.
Yeah. What's interesting to me is, one of the words that you used when we first started talking today was prescient, right? That when we were talking about Good Bones, that question you had gotten, or the way that you were writing those poems may have been sort of prescient. And that it's interesting because I feel like Good Bones, the poem, sort of has this cycle of it sort of makes the rounds again every time something humongous happens in the world. And we talked about that at the time, about that being kind of a strange position to be in as the writer of that poem, that it's gratifying, but also just kind of strange. And I feel like in a certain way, there is also something like that with this book and the tweets that they're based on as well, where, as we said, you started writing these in 2018, which at the time, 2018 felt like a lot, but now, we had no idea. We had no idea
how much was coming.
Right. But I feel like what's interesting is that, when I've seen people talking about sort of whether it's the blurbs on the cover or whether it's a review or just people talking about, the advanced copy that they saw on Twitter, I feel like there's sort of a thread of people talking about you and this book and these tweets as like exactly perfect for this time, and like you're some kind of an oracle or something, And it just strikes me that, the experience of that must be sort of similarly complex for you. Can we talk about that a little bit?
That's so interesting. I haven't processed these tweets or this book in the same way that I've processed Good Bones. that the poem was published in 2016. The book came out in 2017. I still see, not a day goes by that someone doesn't share the poem and tag me on some social media platform. It may not be, usually it happens sort of en masse when there's some disaster. But right now, I think even with just how insecure and scared we're all feeling, it's being shared a lot just generally right now. But yeah, it's interesting. I really didn't think that I was writing. Well, first of all, I didn't think I was writing a book for anyone other than me. And I didn't think it would be timely in this sort of wider, larger way, because of course I was writing about my own personal struggles. And I thought, well, I do think they're applicable to other people's personal struggles, but I had no idea that we all had coming around the bend the size of the sort of collective struggle that we have now. There's no way I could have known that. And had I known, unlike some people who found out about this early, I would have said something. I would have been screaming it from the mountaintops, not just quitting my job and going quietly away. Let's be clear. Yeah, it's so strange. In some ways, the book was bumped. It was supposed to come out in May, and it's coming out in October instead. And I thought, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm releasing this book in a pandemic year. Really? I write a book about this, the most terrible year I lived through, and now the book is delayed because we're living through yet another terrible year. And it seems like the timing couldn't be worse. And then I thought about it and I thought, well, on the other hand, the timing couldn't be better, because I think, I don't know, we all need to really believe in our own resilience right now in order to just get up and get through every day. And whether that just means going to work or working from home or sending your kids off to school and being worried about them, or schooling them at home and being worried about your own sanity and their own. The lives we lived last year aren't the lives we are living now. And we really don't know what the lives that we'll live next year will look like. And that feeling is so close to what I was feeling at the time that I wrote this book. So I feel like in some ways it's kind of perfect, because the spirit in which I wrote the book, I think, will match the spirit in which it is received, if that makes sense. Or at least the kind of emotional weather that I was experiencing when I wrote the book is our sort of collective emotional weather right now. So maybe it will help someone who's having a hard time right now get a fresh perspective on what might be possible on the other side of all of this. I say, gesturing with my hands, just at the wider world, all this, because everybody's all this looks different. What I've gone through is different from what you've gone through and what others have gone through. But we do have this collective grief and anger and fear that we're grappling with right now. And on one hand, it's terrible. But on the other hand, part of me thinks, gosh, I can't remember a time in my life, probably because there hasn't been one, where I feel like no matter where you live and who you are, your concerns are my concerns.
There is something, if nothing else, there is something about this idea of being in it together that I don't know if it exactly takes the edge off of things, because I think we are all still feeling the edge quite a bit.
Yeah, we are.
But, at least this sense of not being entirely alone in these things is helpful in some way. I definitely agree with that. So I wanted to go back a little bit to something that you said in the beginning, and this is also something that you say very early in the book about how, at the time you were going through your divorce, that that you were having difficulty writing poetry and you needed a different kind of writing? Because this is something that I think is interesting. I think so much of the book is about sort of changing one's conception of one's own life. So for someone who is very used to thinking of herself as a poet, to be changing your engagement with the craft of writing must have been significant. But I wanted to sort of talk about like what it is about the form of poetry or the form of essay, like these different shapes, these different containers, like what it is that this enables or sort of obstructs in terms of what you're able to express. Can we talk about that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think in some ways it's not as much about me being a poet. It's about the kind of poet I am, which is to say I'm a whittler. So my poems get smaller as I revise. So I might begin with an idea and I write longhand first, always. My brain, I actually never learned how to type. So my brain works with my pen. My brain doesn't work with my 2 index fingers, which are the only things I use to type anything. Yeah, I never learned how to properly type. So the idea of sitting down to type something, it's sort of like the next stage. Once I get something that has a shape, then I key it in to my laptop. But everything happens either in a notebook or on a legal pad. And it starts out a total mess. And oftentimes I'm kind of circling one thing and then drawing an arrow to something else or numbering things on the page like, ooh, yeah, I want this image to come first. And then I think it's going to go swoop over here. And this is going to be 2. And then down here at the bottom of the page, I jotted something down. I think that's the transition. So I'm going to write a 3 there. And then when I get to a point where I'm ready to type it, I would type it in that order and then start sort of futzing around with it using copy paste and thinking about line length and stanza and sound and sort of what might happen. But it always gets smaller. It almost never grows. And, I'm also certainly a lyric poet, which is to say my poems don't tend to tell stories and they tend not to be very chatty. They tend, I think, to be pretty concise, pretty reduced. I mean, I'm really working to crystallize a moment and sort of get to the essence of something when I'm writing a poem. And so I'm always asking myself, like, what is essential here? What is essential for the reader? What is essential for me? What can go? I'm always looking to let things go. I'm kind of like this in life too. I'm like the opposite of a hoarder. I'm always thinking, what can I get rid of? Like I love to clean out a closet. What do I not need? That is always my question. And so I write like that. That's how I write poems. It's really hard to tell a story or have any background if that's how you write poems. It doesn't work. So I remember really distinctly I had a writer in residency gig at the University of Arizona in November, December of 2018. And so I had just started doing the tweets maybe a month before, and I was in Tucson in this little cottage apartment at the university, and I was supposed to be writing poems and putting together a book of poems. And I did write some poems. But what also happened was I tried to write a poem about my house and how it's like home, but it's not quite home because my now ex-husband was going to be moving out and how strange that was. And I realized I can't write this as a poem. I need to bring in things that I can't do in this poem. That doesn't mean that another poet couldn't have done it. It's just not the kind of poem that I'm comfortable writing. And so I ended up reaching out to a friend of mine who writes essays and saying, oh my God, I think I'm writing an essay. It was like a panic moment. Like, what's happening? And she's like, yep, it sounds like you're writing an essay. Just go with it. And so that ended up being a piece that appeared in the New York Times Modern Love in early January. And it's funny to me reading that Modern Love essay thinking, what part of me thought I could make that a poem. Like, you can't, it would have been the weirdest poem. How do you do that in a poem? And so that's just one example of sometimes it just doesn't work. And oftentimes I just sort of start jotting down an idea, and I don't really have a clear idea about what the genre of the piece will be. But I think the language leads you to the door that says essay or the door that says poem. And most of the time, I try the door that says poem first, because that's where I'm comfortable. And I only open the door that says essay. If the door that says poem, it just won't open for me.
It's, I sometimes struggle with that myself. Some of the poems that I've been trying to work on, there's a poem that I've been working on for like probably 3 or 4 years now that I can't decide if it really ought to be a poem or an essay or maybe like a flash fiction piece. I can't quite figure it out, but hopefully I'll get there at some point. It does strike me, when you talk about being a lyrical poet that your poems don't tell stories, that there are some exceptions, but yeah, a lot of your poems seem to be more about like a moment than a bigger context, which I can see how that would be sort of difficult to put these thoughts into that shape. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of like a Polaroid, right? And then an essay is like a short film. And so if I can make it work in a Polaroid, just one little snapshot or one little focused in moment, that's great. But sometimes, it just doesn't work. I feel like I can't do what I need to do in that small a space.
Yeah. It's interesting too, talking about the language sort of leading you in a direction. Language is, and this was also something that, you mentioned in the book about your process of writing poems being that you don't start with the idea, you start with the language and then sort of follow that where it will lead. But there's also, I feel like there's still a very strong fascination with language in this book in a number of different ways, because, for example, like there is sort of an extended metaphor of writing for life, right? Like of revision being sort of a way of understanding motion into the future. But even more specifically than that, in these essays, there are sort of meditations on individual words like kintsugi or metamorphosis. And another thing that I noticed too is how at several points in the book, there's this sort of repetition of this idea of there is no name for this thing. Like there is no name for a mother of almost a child, or there is no name for a person who is grieving a person who's still alive. And so this way that language comes into this thing, it still feels very much like the same kind of thing, right? Where the language is sort of how you're shaping the thought, or even that the language comes first and the lack of language becomes part of what leads you, or the shape of this existing particular word is what's leading you in a direction. So it does feel a little similar still. Does that ring at all true?
Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, it's funny. A lot of the poems I've written over the past few years are meditations on specific words or phrases or idioms. So I'm always thinking about the roots of words. I mean, I'm such a word nerd. So whenever someone will say, like someone said the other day, like, well, usually aphorisms are pithy. And I thought, ooh, pithy. What's the origin of pithy? It must be pith, right? Like the fruit, like the white part of an orange that no one wants to eat. And so then I went down a rabbit hole and traced it to Old Dutch for basically an Old Dutch word meaning the pit of the fruit, meaning the sort of like essence of the thing. So something pithy gets at the essence of a thing. Well, I mean, that gives me so much pleasure to go down that rabbit hole and think about the word and sort of the metaphorical freight that it drags along with it, whether or not it ever shows up in a poem or an essay. And so, yeah, I mean, I remember having a conversation with my editor at one point, and she's like, I feel like there might be too many instances in this book where you're talking about the origins of words. I was like, I'm a poet. What are you talking about? This is my jam. So yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about that all the time. I mean, the language is the participant, right? Like when I sit down to write a poem, it's me and the language. And sometimes the language brings something to the table that I get so excited about because I can use it like the pit of the fruit. And sometimes I sit down and I want the language to participate with me, and I realize there is no word for what I want to say. Oftentimes what I find is there are sort of like untranslatable things. And that's kind of what I think that's why metaphor appeals to me so much. And this book is full of them. You know, when we have a hard time describing how something feels, it's just natural, I think. And I don't even think this is a poet thing. I think this is a human thing. It's natural to make a metaphor to describe how something feels. I mean, there's a reason why we use the sort of, you know, butterfly metamorphosis metaphor to talk about personal transformation all the time. And so I don't even think that, you know, so we use metaphor all the time, all of us, in just everyday speech, and often just aren't cognizant of it because these words and phrases have just made their way into our everyday language. And only when you stop and really look up the word origin are you thinking really directly about it.
I think it's interesting because, you know, for me, reading these sort of meditations on language or moments in the book where you get sort of stopped by the fact that there isn't a word for this thing. So much of the book is about moving into an unknown future. And, you know, what strikes me is that because you know, by the time you're a few months old, your brain gets sort of organized around words. Your thoughts become words instead of just sensations, right? That there's almost this way of words and names being a kind of almost like incantation, right? Like that if you can name something that, you know, that you can get your arms around it then, or perhaps that the word or the language or the ability to put it into sentences and paragraphs is like having a map, even if what you're doing is describing something that already is, that it allows you to feel a little more comfortable and maybe a little more, not control, but like agency in moving into the unknown. Does that feel right to you at all?
I like that word agency because my first instinct was, of course, because naming is a kind of control. But then I thought that sounds sort of Machiavellian in a way that I don't like. But even, you know, thinking back sort of metaphorically, even to the Genesis story, it's like, who has the power? The person who names. And, you know, being able to name a thing in a way is a way of containing it. Like, I recognize it. I know what it is. It has a name. You know, even a diagnosis in a way is like that. Like, oh, that's what it is.
Yeah.
And it makes us feel, I agree, agency is a better word than control. I think there's sort of an element of like security or comfort and having a name for things, because again, the unknown is terrifying. And oftentimes, say, for example, with a diagnosis, we say, well, it's worse. The not knowing is the worst part. Once they tell you what it is, at least then you can make a plan, right? You know what it is. It makes sense. You can wrap your mind around it, and then you can move forward and know what to do. But when you don't know, it's hard to act because what are you dealing with? I love what you say about the book really being about moving into an unknown future, because I think on one hand, I think that's exactly right. And the more I think about that, the more I realize, well, Maggie, you were always moving into an unknown future. I mean, I'm not a fortune teller.
Right.
So, you know, and I talk about that in the book too, is that yes, having a marriage end or losing someone close to you or whatever sort of trauma or catastrophe or upheaval makes you re-examine your life. It might make you feel like, well, suddenly you don't know what your future is, but you didn't know before either.
Yeah.
You just kind of took for granted that it would continue to be what it was at the time.
Yeah.
But we don't know. I mean, we really don't know. And I think part of writing this book was me confronting that, which is I didn't know then and I don't know now. And really the difference is that I'm not living with any sort of, I don't want to say complacency, but I think sometimes it's easy for us to just kind of get comfortable and assume that we know what the future will look like because we know what the present looks like. And we're almost sort of copy pasting that in our minds into the future. Like it will look like this, but like it'll just keep going. But that's not always the case. And in fact, is never the case. It will always change. It may not change in such a dramatic way as your marriage ending or someone you love dying or you know, your career ending or something that's really dramatic, but you really don't know what tomorrow or next year will be like. And I think we try to avoid thinking about that as much as humanly possible. And maybe one of the things about the pandemic that's been most unnerving for us is that we're having to confront that. Not knowing. It's become necessary for us to really think about the unknown future because it just is. We really don't know.
Yeah. And that anxiety about not having control over things is certainly what drives, I think, a lot of, well, I mean, I think just basically everything in our culture and politics right now. But
just life.
Yeah. But it does strike me, you know, you said you don't know if it's something particular to a poet, this way of using language, of making metaphor. It does strike me, though, that if what language can do, like in your example of a diagnosis, that it gives you something to hold on to, or maybe that having a word to put to something, or a sentence or a paragraph, putting language to something is a way of understanding it, at least in some way. I think that what poets and other writers and even other artists are often particularly skilled at is at looking at things for what they are rather than what we might be, you know, what our preconceived notion of it might be. I mean, not all artists do that, but it is something that I think a lot of artists do. And that, you know, a lot of your previous work, a lot of your poems are kind of, you know, if a poem of yours is sort of explicating a moment, or not even explicating a moment, but presenting a moment, depicting a moment, it is very much about like stopping and looking at that moment and actually seeing it rather than letting it just kind of go by unexamined. And this is sort of, I think, a similar thing to what is happening with the act of putting language to these things in this book. You know what I mean?
I love that. Yes, I do know what you mean.
Well, why don't we take a quick little break and then we'll come back and do the second segment.
That sounds great.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
So I've been thinking a lot about community, and I think it's probably because we're so isolated right now. But I was thinking, okay, so could we perhaps talk about literary community, general community, and then maybe while we're at a distance, necessarily, how technology and social media maybe act as sort of helpers in that regard, or maybe get in the way and give us a false sense of that kind of togetherness. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, that sounds interesting. Where would you like to start?
Well, so I've been thinking about, you know, writing this book in particular and thinking about, you know, I was saying posting these tweets about feeling alone and then hearing back from people really all over the world saying, oh, I feel the same way, but maybe for a different reason. And how even in our sort of deep loneliness and isolation, whether it's imposed because of the pandemic or whether it's just the sort of headspace we're in because of things that are happening in our personal lives, how we're able to connect with people in ways that feel surprisingly sincere, despite the fact that it's happening, via phones and iPads and laptops, and it's all two-dimensional on a screen. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm curious about what your experience of community has been in the ether and if that's changed at all in the pandemic.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the word that you used about being surprisingly sincere, like I don't even know if that's surprising to me anymore, and part of this just has to do with my own personal history that, I've been some version of what we now call extremely online since probably like 1990. So
I love extremely online. It's like TM.
But like, I mean, I was, it started off in like local bulletin board, dial-in bulletin boards, then like chat rooms, like AOL chat rooms, and then, news groups and, whatever the early internet looked like in the mid 90s. And now it's social media. There is, I think, back then, this idea that someone could spend a lot of their time looking at a screen and feeling some form of connection. In 1995, that would have been a very strange idea. And it was a strange idea, even though there were a lot of people doing it. And now I think what's interesting for me is not so much surprise that people can have authentic and sincere connections across a distance that way, but rather, I think lately what's been on my mind is more thinking about the ways that it is different from other kinds of connection. Like I spent so much of my life insisting that no, like these are my real friends and this is a real relationship that I have with such and such a person. And that is still true. I still believe that, but there is something that feels different and not necessarily better or worse.
Yeah.
But just different. And that's been on my mind a lot lately.
That's funny. I mean, I have only been extremely online really for the past few years. I didn't have a computer in my home in high school. So, in the late 90s, mid 90s, I had email in college, but I never did I didn't have a MySpace. I didn't do AOL chat rooms. I really had nothing other than, I think, Facebook. I joined when I had my daughter so that I could share photos with relatives who lived, far away. Mm-hmm. And Twitter was really a thing that came about because of, being a poet and thinking, well, wouldn't it be cool to be able to say, hey, people who live in Little Rock, I'll be giving a reading in your town, and be able to reach people in that way. But I really haven't, it's funny because I think people now are like, oh yeah, you're online all the time. I'm like, well, it's a pretty recent development for me. I really don't have a history of being online all that much. But it's funny what you say about, these are my real friends. I absolutely feel that way. And sometimes I'll say something to a friend here in person and I'm like, oh yeah, my friend so-and-so. And they're like, oh, how do you know them? And I'm like, well, actually, we've never met. But we've been friends for 10 years or 8 years or 4 years or however long. And we only communicate on Twitter, or we only are friends on Facebook. And I remember when was this? I guess it was 2017 or 2018. I made an appointment to get a tattoo in Asheville, North Carolina. And so I drove from Columbus, Ohio to Asheville. I don't know, it was like 8 hours to get a tattoo, but I was smart enough. I was like, well, maybe I should do something professional while I'm here. So I booked a reading at Malaprops. And I was like, where am I going to stay? And I had 2 writer friends that I knew on Twitter only. And I ended up staying at their house and like meeting their son and having family meals at their table. And it was completely normal, did not feel weird at all. We interacted in the same sort of spirit and with the same warmth that we interacted with online. And then I left, and I have not seen them since. But if I was ever back in Asheville, or if they were in Columbus, I would absolutely want to see them and get together with them. And I think for people who don't have a sort of, I don't know, full online life, that might seem strange. Like you slept in some stranger's guest room, but they didn't feel like strangers to me, and they weren't.
Yeah. I think you and I are, we're pretty close to the same age. And I feel like people our age.
1977. I'm just going to say it, 1977.
79 for me. So
okay, perfect.
Pretty close.
Yeah.
And I feel like people our age, like there's about a 5-year span of people from like maybe 1976 to like 1981 or 82 kind of thing, where you get older than that and nobody grew up with a computer, and you get younger than that and everybody grew up with a computer. But like we're in this kind of in between little gray area, you know?
Yeah, totally.
So like I think people that are more than maybe 4 or 5 years younger than us would probably find that kind of thing a little less strange. Like the idea of you've never met somebody, like even what it means to meet somebody is different for younger people than it is for people our age and older. I think it's so interesting. You know, one of the things for me that is interesting about considering the differences between my online relationships and online only relationships and my in-person friendships, especially now when in-person is kind of not really a thing.
Modified in-person friendships.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think this might even be something more specific to men than, you know, people in general. But I often find that I have a much easier time being sort of open and emotionally vulnerable online, or even via email, than I do with people that I see face to face. I think there is a certain, like everybody has a need to connect and have like real, authentic experiences with other people. And that has been really stressed and strained for a lot of people the past 6 months because we can't get together. And so, you know, looking at online spaces is sort of the alternative that we have. For me, what I've been noticing is that a lot of the kind of commiserating and like talking about how I actually feel about things is something that I can do more easily with people that I met online. Whether or not I've ever met them face to face, it's easier for me to do with people that I met online than it is for me to do with people, and especially other men that I met in person and that I know, whether they're people I know from work or from, you know, when I was in school or things like that. And I think that has kind of always been true. I think that has kind of always been the allure of onlineness. Like even going back to like when I was a teenager and I was that version of online.
Yeah.
So this sort of intimacy that, like, I feel like online spaces encourage at least one form of intimacy. They sort of facilitate a form of intimacy. But I also kind of feel like lately it's been feeling unsatisfactory to me. You know, like it's not enough for me. And I don't know if other people feel that way, but it's been more that way for me than it was maybe a couple of years ago.
Well, I think we have less in-person. I mean, certainly we have less in-person contact right now. So it's like maybe if you were able to have a lot of in-person time with people in your life, friends and family members, and you were kind of supplementing in a way with all of your contacts that you have online, when everybody is at a distance, it does feel sort of diluted and unsatisfying. But I also agree. I think it's easier for me to be vulnerable in writing and not in real time. So I can tweet or write a letter or send an email or text something that I might not say if the person was right in front of me. I mean, there's a reason love letters are a thing, right? Because you wouldn't just say everything you would write in a love letter. The person were sitting on the couch next to you, you would just be like, do you want a glass of water? So it's like the small talkiness that invades and takes up so much of our time in-person relationships just gets sort of trimmed away, I think, in the sort of online space. And we tend to just say the thing, which is really appealing, but also maybe not translatable to a real person. Like, I sometimes wonder, I never had to do the online dating thing. And I guess I shouldn't say never, because God knows it's an unknown future, but I have not had to do the online dating thing. And it makes me wonder if that would be a problem, because especially for writers, if you're used to being able to be sort of articulate and vulnerable and emotional, either on the phone or in writing, when you don't have a person right in front of you and you have that distance, and then you have to sort of transition into having an in-person meeting, if you would just completely choke and not be able to be the eloquent person you were in writing. My suspicion is, yes, I would probably choke. I'd be like, would you like a glass of water?
It's interesting. I can maybe get a little overly meta at this point. This show, right? This podcast that I do, it took me a while to figure out what it was, why I do it, and what it is that informs my approach to the conversations that I have with people on this show. And what it is, and what I realized it has always been about, is about connection, about trying to have an authentic conversation between me and another person. And I think that in that respect, it is extremely fulfilling for me, that I get to have conversations with people that, at least to me, feel very real and meaningful and authentic. And I feel like I actually get to connect with people, and many of whom I, wouldn't have had the opportunity to talk to if not for this show.
Yeah.
And so in that respect, I mean, this is something, what you were just saying about writers and, speaking versus writing. It comes up actually a fair amount when I'm booking someone to be on the show, is that sometimes people will express a certain anxiety about whether or not they'll be able to talk to me as articulately as they would if it were like an email interview,
Right.
It actually very rarely works out that the people I talk to on the show are inarticulate or even particularly uncomfortable. I mean, to me, it always feels like a good conversation. And so in that way, this is in the same way. Like right now, because of the way I do these episodes, these recordings, I do them almost exclusively, not in person. And I have the video turned off in order to save bandwidth. And so I can't see you right now. I can just hear your voice. But I still, the two of us talking, I feel a connection. And that is something that is filling a certain need for a certain kind of conversation and connection and intimacy between human beings that I need, right? But, when I put this in the context of friendship, I think one of the things that this show does for me that is very similar to other forms of online friendships. And I would say that many of the people that I talk to on the show either already were my friends or after being on the show have become friends of mine.
Yeah.
And not all of them. And I don't have an expectation that everyone that comes on the show is going to want to be best buddies with me forever. But I think that I do have a, connection with many of the people that I talk to. But the thing that makes it a little different, and the thing that makes it different with basically any of my Twitter friends or Facebook friends that I don't actually know that well, or maybe people on an internet forum that I used to go on, is that even if I'm having a fairly frequent connection with people and I'm touching base with people maybe a couple of times a week or even daily, there is still this sense that they're not necessarily in my life in the same way that my in-person friends are. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
I can have
totally.
a really great conversation on this show for an hour and a half with someone, and I feel really fulfilled after it. But then at the end of it, I'm just back in my life. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I think there's sort of a different texture to sort of a spoken conversation than there is to, say, like an email interview. Like you can send someone a list of questions in an email, and then they can very carefully curate a response. But there's some kind of texture that's lost in not actually having that happen in real time, which, sometimes is nice because you can actually be more articulate maybe than you would be in the moment. But you lose something too. Yeah. Like there's like a tone shift or something. It just feels like the temperature, I think, is different. Like it's cooler temperature wise to interact with people not in real time. And it's warmer, whether it's just voice or video or whatever, it's warmer to have an actual conversation with someone where you're actually having to have the rhythm of a conversation and you're hearing their voice and giving them space and waiting or maybe laughing over something that they say and interjecting. And it feels like temperature wise dialed up to me in a way that is more satisfying than an email exchange. Like I don't think anybody gets any kind of personal satisfaction from an email exchange. I had the house to myself yesterday and today because these are the days that my kids are with their dad. And it's wonderful. I love having these quiet days to myself, but I also love having an adult conversation. And that's what this is. And it wouldn't feel like an adult conversation if we had done this via email. It would have felt like work.
Yeah. I find it really interesting that oftentimes, speaking about the kind of intimacy that online communication sort of facilitates, in some ways, not just on Twitter, but even like I think in some ways I'm more myself when I talk to people on the show than I am if I'm talking to them on the phone or if I have them over to my house. Like I'm more willing to go here than I. Yeah. I don't know. It's just sort of a weird, I don't know, almost paradox. I'm not sure exactly how it works, but there is something there. Yeah.
I love that. Well, I told someone was asking, what are you doing today? And I was like, I've got a thing in the morning. And then I'm recording a podcast with my friend Mike at 3. and he goes, who's your friend Mike? And I was like, well, we've never met, but we've talked before. But again, I mean, it's funny. You're right. I think generationally, people who are younger than me don't find that odd at all. Mm-hmm. But if I told my mother today that I was having, a chat online with my friend Mike for an hour and a half, she'd be like, have I met him? Is that Mike from high school? Is that the one that came to the house for dinner? I'm like, no, you've never met him. And yeah, no, you've never met him. And I think that the idea of having people in your life who you've never had real substantial in-person contact with it's a 21st century thing.
Yeah.
But it's also lovely. I mean, if you came to Columbus, I would take you to dinner, post COVID. And if I were in your city, I would absolutely text you and say, do you want to get a cup of coffee? Because I happen to be like, I'm in town. So I don't know. I think it's kind of lovely that we're able to do this. And it makes, I mean, for me, I'm someone I've lived in my hometown all my life. So even though, typically I would be traveling a lot for readings and events, and, I'm in a different world, I might be on a plane a few times a month going to different places. Home base is very much home base. Mm. And so for me, it's like particularly lovely to have, genuine connections with people who live all over, who I may or may not get to cross paths with at some point down the line. But it's always one of those things where, I'm going to be in Seattle. I have 2 people I know who are there. I would love to see if we could meet for coffee or lunch and make the sort of jump from the ether into the actual world.
Yeah.
It's never gone badly either. I've never had an experience where I knew someone online. I mean, okay, I'm actually knocking wood right now because I think that it could be very creepy at some point. But, I've never had an experience where I had a connection with somebody online and then met them in person and was disappointed or felt like I had read the situation wrong or, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I do. Yeah, I've been doing this for almost 30 years now, and I can't think of a time when it's gone really poorly either. So
yeah, but I think in the online interaction whether or not it's going to work or not, right?
Yeah.
I mean, when people comment on your posts or when you have a conversation with someone in the ether, you can kind of get a sense of their personality and if they would be someone that you would want to have lunch with or not.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I can say, like whatever else I am feeling about these things is that I am really grateful that I at least we have this avenue available to us right now, because I think for almost everybody it would be a lot harder if we didn't.
Oh my gosh, I can't imagine going through this year without social media. I really can't. I mean, yes, it can be a rabbit hole. And yes, if you wake up and the first thing you read in the morning is the news, it may send you down a doom spiral. So there are dangers there too. But I think just the human connection that we're able to make from, state to state and country to country just feels really essential to me right now to not feel like I'm by myself.
Yeah. Yeah. Same. So there's one question that I like to end with, and that is if there's a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Ooh, that's a good question. Two things come to mind. One is Sabrina Ora Mark's column, I think it's called Happily, in the Paris Review, which is becoming a book, but I don't know if you've read these, but they're these essays that are based on fairy tales. They sort of use fairy tale tropes, but they're about sort of current events and what's going on in her life. And it's every time I see that there's a new one, I mean, even if I'm like halfway through making a meal for my children, I'm just like, everybody sit down. Mom's going to read this, and then we'll get right back to your regularly scheduled programming. So that is one of them. And then I'm trying to think what else. I got a terrific record this week, the new Angel Olsen. And highly, it's on Jaguar, and I highly recommend it. She's got this sort of like beautiful, kind of trilly, sort of vintagey sounding voice. And actually, I think she lives in Asheville, so that kind of brings things back to my visit there. But it's funny, really. Through all of this, I have been overspending on books and records. And I feel like that's, it's a good thing to be spending money on those things because artists need our support right now, especially being unable to tour. But it's been like the one thing I feel like, well, if we can't go out, if I can't go to concerts, if I can't go to restaurants, if I can't do this, then I'm just going to funnel that into my books and record budget. So that's what we're doing.
Yeah, definitely. Same here. Well, thank you so much for talking with me. I really appreciate it, and I had a great time talking to you.
Me too. My pleasure.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the show, there's a link in the show notes you can use to purchase your own copy of Keep Moving. I highly recommend picking up a copy, and of course, I also recommend supporting your local independent bookstore or local library. Maggie has upcoming virtual events on October 8th, 14th, and 15th, which you can find links for in the show notes, and more events through November 14th, which you can find on her website at maggiesmithpoet.com/events. Do check those out. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me. The music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help on this episode is by Shea Aguinaldo. Word of mouth is the best thing for independent podcasts like this one, so if you enjoyed today's conversation, I'd love it if you told a friend, shared the episode on social media, that sort of thing. If you're feeling so moved, you can even tag the show at ChannelOpenPod in your tweets. You can find all of the rest of the show's social media information, email newsletter, show notes, and transcripts at keepthechanneleopen.com. Our next episode will be a KTCO book club conversation with writer Elisa Herod. We'll be talking about Tove Jansson's 1982 novel, The True Deceiver. That will be coming on October 21st, so stay tuned for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.